Hello, everyone, and welcome to another installment in the Uprera talk series. My name is Anka Anton. I'm the Director of Public Relations and Administration of Uprera, which is the European Public Relations Education and Research Association. We are a European association dedicated to the research and the education in the fields of public relations and strategic communication, with over 500 members across more than 50 countries, some of them even outside Europe. We are currently in the process of submissions for our annual congress. So if you'd like to participate in our staple event, please have a look at uprera.org for more information. But one of the core activities and one of the core structures of our associations is represented by our thematic networks. And in these thematic networks, our members research a lot of the topics that they are interested in. And during the webinar today, you are going to hear research done on a topic that kind of brings together two of these thematic networks: the history of PR network and the women in PR network. So I would like to introduce the moderator for today's webinar, Tasos Theofilou. Hello, Tasos.
Hi, Anka. Thanks for
Hi.
having us.
Thank you for being here. This is a very special webinar because, maybe Tassos will tell you a little bit more. We are across several time zones and several continents, which is quite a unique feat to achieve. So thank you very much for organizing this, for putting together this webinar, and I will give you the floor to tell us more about it. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that. I was wondering if I can upload my slides as well. So we can. There we go. So we can actually have some context to it. Good morning, Australia. Good morning, Monash University. Good afternoon, Alabama. And hello to Europe, the continent that never sleeps. I think it's now 12 o'clock midnight in Europe. It's 10 p.m. in the UK. So my name is Dr. Tasos Theofilou, former head of department and current chair of the International History of Public Relations Conference, and lead of the network of the European PR History Network of Uprera. I'm here today with two distinguished guests, Dr. Kate Fitch from Monash University, Australia, and Martina from University of Alabama, US, to talk to you about women in PR history. In all fairness, our webinar can be exhaustive on the topic. I mean, how could it be? However, we will make an effort to shed some light on this area. So why are we here? The field of history is one of the many angles of PR research. It is an angle that we as scholars and researchers have been contributing to. The main gateway for this field has been the International History of PR Conference and its younger cousin, the European PR History Network, EPRHN of Uprera. What we've accomplished since the foundation of the International History of PR Conference by Emeritus Professor Tom Wansel back in 2009 is, I think, extraordinary for the field. We've had a series of conferences. We are now working towards a 13th conference, which is going to take place in July. We've had books published, book series, and as you can see, a good number of special issues, which of course come along with special thanks and a lot of gratitude to people like Karen Russell, Tim Coombs, Benglik Shah, and of course Martina Toppitz. But what is more important is that we have given PR history a voice based on scientific rigor and solid foundations, a loud and clear voice which allows the PR story to be documented by scholars in different countries, industries, angles, and people. The whole publication journey, if you will, following Tom's very successful series on national perspectives on development of PR, Started by going through the International History of PR Conference proceedings, where through that exercise, we observed some very interesting research area which have been developing, such as history of governmental communication, great men of PR, history of crisis communication, history of PR events, national PR, historical approaches, methodological approaches on PR history, and of course, today's subject, which is women in PR history. The last area caught the eye of many of us, and we kind of decided to do something about it in an attempt to create knowledge in the field of women in PR history. I think it was in 2017, the seventh International PR Conference, which brought again together PR history aficionados to discuss, among other areas of PR research and historiography, an additional theme, which was about back then her story of public relations. Some papers were included in the History of PR special issue of the Journal of Public Relations Research, while more were published in our first edited book of the History of PR series published by Routledge. Um, this series offered the opportunity to learn from a potpourri of research outputs. It starts by Stapitonanda, my God, Parishar, you have a difficult name to pronounce, uh, who indicates, while exploring Nang Nopamas in more proto PR like observation, that women have been influencing, intentionally or not, PR like activities in Thailand. Humerids and Bitsaksi report how three Turkish women pioneers, Mardin, Ayded, and Gungor, who served as ZIPRA presidents of the decades 1990, 2000, and 2010, influenced the shaping of the role of PR practitioners' code of conduct, and of course highlight gender differences. Aktas, Ozdemir, and Hizal's research reached similar conclusions on their study about women in PR when exploring the case of Turkey. Suket presents an excellent case when describing how Paddy Schubert made a breakthrough for women in PR education and PR industry in Malaysia. Schubert seemed to have an extremely, perhaps intuitive understanding for culture and led the way for women in both industries of education and PR. Spencer and Hill present the case of the first African American pioneer of the field. Authors describe the inspiring story of Ines Kaiser, who overcame race and gender related obstacles. Kaiser's work influenced not only PR industry, but also gender and race equality. Ines Kaiser was the first woman to open a PR agency dealing with national accounts on her work advocating for women and minorities in the business world. Women also have been affecting explicitly the development of the sector in niche areas like entertainment and arts, allowing us to draw some interesting concluding remarks. Fitch, who will be hearing later on about it, adds knowledge to this area when discussing how Stewart's work in the entertainment of PR offered a different angle beyond corporate parameters and from a gender perspective by going into PR in relation lifestyle, sport, travel, retail, amongst other sectors. Stewart's campaign to promote Oriental cavalcade, did I say that correct, Kate? I hope, produced and perpetuated stereotypes around Asian cultures. On a similar note, Garcia Martinez and Zifra also found that arts and entertainment offered space for women PR pioneers to excel. In their work, they concluded how Helena Lumbreras, and I quote, filmography sheds light on the dual task of women in the private domestic sphere when that sphere is turned into space for struggle and intervention, while they also seek to maintain their place in the working world. Um, Wright, Don Wright observes that the road of professionalization is not a bed of roses, and that women, even though they have come a long way in PR, they still have a long way to go in terms of work discrimination, bias, and prejudices, in addition to pay gap, a finding which agrees with Topitz et al. 2019. One may observe that historically women have been affecting the field of PR from the times of proto PR until late developments. Either through nature or nurture, women excelled and have been contributing to all areas of PR at a national and international level, leaving a mark, laying the foundations, and of course, contributing leading developments. Um, hopefully I laid the ground and set the bar there enough from me to dominate this discussion. I would like to pass to my wonderful colleagues, starting with Martina, to discuss about specific studies in the field of women in PR history. Martina, how about you take us through your study?
Hello, thank you for a lovely introduction. I apologize for crashing in and out. Of all days, of course, the maintenance is today, naturally, why not? But my presentation is about British PR history, and in that spirit, you can see my mug here. So the presentation is on Lady Nancy Astor and her political PR. This is not the area of research I'm normally interested in. It's not something I normally research. What I do research, and I have been running that project for many years now, is researching the political PR of British government and particularly behavioral campaigns, which I believe were well ahead of time, very well executed. For example, Coughs and Sneezes campaign, the British of the 1930s and 1940s, already in 1940s, there were video adverts in the UK trying to instigate behavioral change in regards to public health, whereas in many countries in Europe, people didn't even have a TV at the time. And then in that context, when researching the British government and what I consider amazing PR that they've done at the time, I accidentally ran into Lady Nancy Astor and her milk campaigns and advocacy for giving milk to children and all these health campaigns that she was running, which I thought was really interesting. And then I was fascinated that Britain had a woman MP so early in history. So then in that context, I've done some research on her political PR because she was the first woman MP in the UK. So that's going to be the presentation that I'm going to do today. Just talk a little bit about her political PR, some of the campaigns she had, and then some of the analysis I've done so far. I presented the first version of this research at the Bournemouth in History of PR conference that you organized, Tasos, and that many of us absolutely love to attend. But that was a very basic analysis. It was just basically a historical narrative, whereas meanwhile I managed to do some more data analysis. I have an absolute mountain of data, but it's very interesting, I believe. So next slide. Thank you. So in terms of the rationale for the study, the majority of the history of PR work is centered on advancing PR theory, which is fine, and some excellent work has been done in the area. But there is this corporate-centric view of PR, which is what Coombs and Holliday argued in their book, Not Just PR. And I agree with their view that we should look at PR more widely, and I'm particularly interested in political PR because I also come from a sociology and political science background. So there is some research, for example, on Ivy Lee, Edward Bernays and their corporate work, plus on corporate women in PR. But when it comes to UK, which I believe is deserving of research, there is a long and fascinating history of political PR by the UK government, which I already mentioned. And then within that context, and roughly at the same time, there is also this first woman MP who resumed office already in 1919 and was an American, actually. And then she also did something very similar. So there is this history of behavioral campaigning in the UK. But when you look at research, it's mainly political research, like government PR, propaganda from World War I, World War II. There is very little about other form of campaigning. So I got really interested in Lady Nancy Astor and what she did. And then I looked it up from this perspective of what is the history of women in political PR? How did women practice political PR? Particularly in relationship to other government campaigns. So I'm looking whether this was a trend at the time in the UK, which for now it looks like it was. And then how did this woman politician manage her reputation with the media and her reputation and identity? And political PR generally rarely features women or women in politics, women's political communication. So I think this is really interesting. Next slide, please. Thank you. Now, in terms of political PR, it has a significant role in political processes throughout history. So there are, for example, people who have done this work, like, such as press secretaries, speech writers, campaign writers, fundraisers, event managers. Political marketing is also a large area, consultants. But it's still a largely unexplored area of research compared, for example, to political communication or public relations generally or political science. So I think it's an emerging area and that there is a lot of interesting stuff that can be done in terms of research. Next slide, please. Thank you. So if you look at differences just briefly between political communication and political PR, political communication is the exchange of symbols and messages between political actors and institutions, the general public, and the news media that are the products of or have consequences for the political system. As opposed to that, political PR is just one aspect of political communication. So political public relations is not only about communication. It's about political public relations, which involves a wider group of major stakeholders than usually conceptualized by political communication, such as industry lobby groups, party members or activists, issues, competitors, think tanks, and party donors. So this is a bit of a difference. And also political PR, unlike for political communication, is usually intentional and objectives driven, which also then brings about this notion that we could potentially expand the wider PR research into political PR and study it. So while the field of political communication and political public relations overlap theoretically, conceptually, and in practice, there is an argument that do not always equal each other. We often see political PR through news management and media relations, but it's actually, excuse me, more than that. Some authors identified it as a management practice or a management process, which is very similar to the traditional definition of corporate PR, for example. So authors are saying that this is a process by which an organization or individual actor for political purposes through purposeful communication and action, and they seek to influence and establish, build and maintain beneficial relationships and reputation with its key publics to help support its mission and achieve its goals. So this is very similar to objectives-driven corporate PR as well. And then authors who work in the field of political PR, and I agree with them, say that it's also a management function, so not just technical or tactical, because it helps in advancing the political organization's principal mission and broad objectives. So some elements of political PR would be news management and agenda building. This is a traditional area that I already mentioned is associated with political PR. And yes, we have issues such as agenda setting, agenda building, so assisting journalists in developing stories, informal communication, availability and information for journalists, dissemination of news, so holding press conferences, so all these elements. There is also building an agenda, which is also part of news management and agenda building. But then there is also issues management, there is event management, crisis management, and assessment evaluation management in political PR. So I'll be looking in these elements to see to what extent we can find them in political PR of Nancy Astor. There is, of course, also digital communication, but this is not relevant for my history research. And now in terms of issues management, for example, identifying, prioritizing, developing, and conveying positions on key issues such as position papers, speeches, platforms, statements, debates. So all these are elements of issues management in political PR. Then in event management, we have debates, speeches, news conferences, party conventions, town hall meetings, fundraising dinners. And then also crisis management is slightly different. But many of these elements are elements of political PR, and I did find them, as findings will show, in Astor's work as well. So just two basic research questions that are guiding me for this particular studies. Are there elements of political PR related to Nancy Astor's work? And if so, which ones? And did she use political PR strategically? Because I was particularly interested in this definition from the literature that political PR is a management function, which relates to how we usually see PR. And then if so, what was the strategy? Now, in terms of context, very briefly, she was the first woman to take seat in the House of Commons on the 1st of December 1919, which was very early for a woman to take seat in Europe. She was born in Virginia, USA, and was a divorced socialite who then came to live in England and met Lord Astor, who was a proprietor of the Observer and had close links with the Times. And then she took his seat basically in the House of Commons from 1919 to 1945 and became an MP for Plymouth Sutton. She was a very popular MP up until the World War II, when she sided with the government that wanted, of Neville Chamberlain, that wanted to appease Hitler. That's when she opposed Britain entering the war, so she lost popularity. But before that, she was very popular because of all these behavioral and public health policies that she was running. This is one of the quotes from her exchange in the Parliament, when she said to Churchill, "If you were my husband, I'd poison your tea." And he replied, "Madam, if you were my wife, I'd drink it." because she was known as an early feminist as well. So like I said, she was very popular in her constituency due to her social policies and help she was giving to local residents. So I've seen lots of letters in the collection where people are asking her to help them find a job, to give them money, to do some community work, and she was mainly saying yes. And she was a declared feminist and seen as a fierce woman, and she was a women's rights supporter, and this is visible in many of her policies and press articles as well. This is just one of the messages she sent to the Manchester Guardian expressing admiration for Dame Millicent Fawcett, who was one of our most notable British feminists. And now these are some of her policies, which was relevant for me to kind of capture and outline so that I can see and basically juxtapose that with her media articles and her campaigns. So women's rights was one of her policies. So for example, lowering the voting age for women to 21, which was passed in 1928. Welfare reforms to include women, equal pay supported other female MPs, regardless of party affiliation. So there are some records of Red Ellen from Labour Party and the friendship. Recruiting women in civil service, then recruiting women to police. Equal Guardianship Act about caring for children, rights for divorced women, right to work for married women. So these are her women's policies. Then changes to legal drinking age, particularly to raise the drinking age to 18, which was passed in 1923. And up to today, many people in UK don't know there was actually Nancy Astor who was behind this law, which is still in place. Then education and nursery schools, building relations with America as well, her homeland. Prison and police reform, and then also major welfare policies such as awarding pensions to blind people of the age of 40 and not 50. And then also, for example, milk policies to give children milk, which was later a policy during the war of the British government, where they were actually rationing milk, but not for pregnant women. So in terms of method, I've done archival research at the University of Reading Special Collections Archive because Lady Nancy Astor had a large collection of all of her correspondence and media appearances and everything. It was very, very rich and very detailed. I had 3 research visits where I was collecting data. And I've done archival research for basically constructing this history a little bit, but then also I applied it to this political PR. And just to acknowledge the funding for 3 research visits was from my previous employer, Leeds Beckett University, with thanks, of course, for the support they gave to my research. And now these are just some issues everything I mapped out. So I've been mapping out in terms of issues management, the way I see it, part of it is also accepted memberships. And the reason this is relevant, and I have a full list of these, is because membership she accepted were very closely aligned to her policies, which signals strategic and a managerial approach to her politics. So, for example, Industrial Welfare Society, Council for the Representation of Women on the League of Nations, Association of Women House Property Managers, Conservative Women's Reform Association. She was a Conservative MP, needs to be emphasized. The Women's Unionist Organization. So you have all these organizations, but if you go back to that slide where I said what her policies are, then it's very, very clear that she only accepted memberships which were closely aligned to her policies. And there is a massive amount of membership requests and support that she was asked to give. And then she said no, unless it was strictly linked to those policies she was already pushing ahead in the parliament. And this is some more memberships because I've been mapping this out. So Early Closing Association, Ladies Committee, Patrons of the Oxford Women College Appeal, a member of the Council for the Josephine Butler Centenary Committee, and then also International Conference of the Press, a British section as well. And there is some more here. I think this is the last slide. Moral and Social Hygiene, where she gave a donation. Then British Institute of Adult Education, Howard League for Penal Reform, so Reform Service. So these are all the associations and memberships she accepted or donated to, which are aligned with her policies and which I see as part of her issues management strategy. And this is another one as well. Now, she also accepted to speak on women's issues with women's organizations and female journalists. So there was that part of issues management. So apart from accepting memberships of organizations which were closely aligned to her policies, she would also speak on women's issues with women organizations, but she would decline other requests to speak which were not aligned to her policies. And this is some correspondence, for example, with Ms. Prats for the Excelsior in 1928, when she was interviewing all women in parliament. And she was particularly inclined, because of her feminist views, to speak to women journalists and support them by giving them interviews. And sometimes she also mediated, there is evidence, to help them reach out to other members of the parliament, women members of the parliament, so to support them kind of to get something more appealing for the newspapers. And these are some, in terms of reputation management and building her reputation, she was also refusing a lot of articles. So she did write articles, and I'm currently analyzing that and mapping it out. She would write articles for the national press, for example, quite a lot about her policies, but then she would also refuse a lot. Obviously, due to the time in which she worked, she was getting lots of gendered requests. So, for example, what Christmas gift man likes best in 1921, it was a request from Yorkshire Evening News, and this was refused. And I noticed in data all of these gendered requests were automatically refused, even if they came from newspapers where her husband was proprietor. She would still say no to those, but then she would accept those which were linked to her policies. And you can see here also privileges and responsibilities of men and women, benefits of the woman's vote, so trying to advocate, so it was all refused. And there is some more here, for example, how she will spend Christmas. She didn't give statements or write articles about her private life. Women's interest in peace, modern womanhood, what it means to be a woman in modern time, that was all refused. And basically, it seems as if she managed her reputation and tried to build her reputation solely on her work, which are things that women politicians still struggle. I published last year a book on women in the media, and in one of the articles on Croatia, for example, some participants actually said in interviews that that women are often not invited to speak about serious issues, so they often go to lifestyle magazines because that's the only exposure they have, and then they get criticism for speaking in lifestyle magazines, but that's actually the only thing they can do. Whereas Nancy Astor already in 1920s actually refused specifically to speak about private issues, about her private life, about a woman's rights generally, in a way that kind of justifies them, and only insisted on professional articles, which is very unusual for the period of time in which she lived. And also these are some accepted articles linked to her policies which are mapped out. So, for example, an article on drink problem, because she was, as I mentioned before, advocating against drinking age being so lower than 18. So she wrote about that. She wrote about article on conservative women, so promoting conservatism, which was her political position. She did write a New Year message on backsliding of London, the destiny of English-speaking people, liquor traffic, but you can see equal pay. But you can see a lot of this is linked to her policies, and a lot of it about drinking, because she had a serious issue with children being allowed to drink, and that was one of her main policies. Then also here, the American magazine on recent trip to America, she did advocate that America is an ally of the UK, that there should be a strong, she was a supporter of the strong relationship between America and the UK. And she was always saying that the only country who would come for help, who would come and help Britain in the time of war would be America, and don't you forget it. She made those statements as well. And then about cinematographic industry, the future of Europe, juvenile employment and educational reform, again, very strictly linked to her policies. And these are just some letters which are kind of put into the presentation, but they are kind of, I think they're relevant because I found letters in her personal correspondence where she refused to sign articles not written by her. So there were attempts from publicists and press agents of the time, and also from some journalists, to kind of prepare an article and say, would you sign it? And the answer was always no. And this is just some of that correspondence, but it doesn't show well on the screen. However, if anybody's interested in slides, I'm happy to share them. So basically, in terms of news management, that's the last part I'm still analyzing. She has written a lot of articles about her policies to build an agenda, and I think there is an evidence of agenda building in her work. And this analysis is ongoing, but I found articles, for example, across all newspapers in the UK, although there is a bit of a bias towards the Times, for example, and the Observer, because her husband was a proprietor. So they They didn't always get a statement they wanted. They didn't always get an article they wanted, but they got it to a larger extent than other newspapers in the UK, from what I can see so far. So in conclusion, for this ongoing work, I think this was an example of early political PR. I think it was done in a very advanced way, and that there is an element of strategic management of policies and agenda building through issues management, news management, and personal reputation building and management. I think based on data that this was a very carefully designed political PR with the purpose to achieve larger support for her policies. And I believe that she was that the reason this constitutes political PR, not just political communication, is because she was trying to appeal to a wider group of major stakeholders than usually conceptualized by political communication, such as activists, issue competitors, think tanks, through her memberships and speeches, donations, expressions of support, and all these activities she was doing. And interestingly, she worked at the same time as PR pioneers and utilized similar strategic communication tools, but then went wider, which I believe then constitutes political PR. So this was my presentation. This work is still ongoing, and it's being done in the larger context of British political PR, which I think personally is a fascinating area. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Martina. That was a great presentation, great evidence. How about we allow some time for the very informative presentation to sink in, and potentially come back to you with some questions. I'll pass the torch to Kate. Kate, what have you been up to? Is it the Stewart campaign you're going to be talking to us about?
Yes, I am. I'm
By
going
all
to.
means.
I should say that this research, I've previously presented on one pilot study, which was on Betty Stewart's establishing a consultancy in 1959, which she claims was the third public relations consultancy in Australia. I haven't found evidence to support that, but it's a good claim that she made retrospectively about her life achievements. That pilot study I completed before COVID, and Betty's records were donated to the Australian Performing Arts Collection, which closed for more than 2 years during COVID. Some of you may know Melbourne was locked down for 6 times, one of the longest lockdown cities in the world. And the joke at the Australian Performing Arts Collection was that I was the last researcher out and the first researcher back in when they finally reopened 2.5 years later. So now it's great to be able to, having completed that archival research, it's great to be able to talk about Betty's whole career and how I think it is significant for understanding not just the historical developments of public relations in Australia, but also more broadly, the role of gender on public relations historiography, how we actually write public relations history, or we write women into that history. So you happy for me just to go right in now? Lovely.
Absolutely, go for it. You're on mute, Kate. You muted yourself. Sorry.
How did I do that? Okay, you can hear me? Yes.
Yes.
I wanted to include this image to show Betty Stewart at work. So this photo is of June and Bob Crosby, and Bob was the brother of the more famous Bing Crosby, arriving at Avalon Airport in Melbourne. And that's Betty on the edge, not quite exiting the frame. And this image captures for me the difficulty in researching women in public relations history. You get a glimpse, you get tantalizing traces, but not quite the full story, even if, as Betty did, the practitioners write and publish their memoirs. And so I want to make the case in this paper that we don't fully understand the historical developments of public relations if we don't understand how women's contributions and how they came, along with other groups, they came to be written out of the history of the field. So this paper introduces Betty Stewart, who is an unheralded public relations practitioner who worked in public relations for over 60 years. There's a number of reasons why Betty remains absent from Australian public relations history, even though she established her own consultancy at the same time as Eric White, who's a dominant figure in narratives of the public relations profession in Australia. And I'd argue first, She's left out because she was a woman. And second, she worked for several decades in entertainment public relations in the theatre music world, starting in the early 1930s. And this doesn't really fit the narrative of professionalisation that underpins the contemporary public relations occupation. It's rare to have women represented in any archives, let alone public relations archives. But Betty has documented her work in a number of ways. She self-published her memoirs in a book called A Survivor in a Star-Spangled World. She recorded an oral history in 2004 with the National Library of Australia. And she donated all her records to the Australian Performing Arts Centre in Melbourne, which are now titled the Betty Stewart Collection. Apparently, I'm the first researcher to actually go in and examine them, so that was quite exciting. Stewart was born in 1915 and she left school at 14 and went to business college before gaining a job as a secretary to the publicity director at J.C. Williamson's. JCW dominated the Australian theatre scene for almost a century, managing theatre venues and touring shows right up until 1979. Stewart left on getting married, but was asked to return to in a more senior role as promotion director during the war. She managed concerts, comedy, musicals, including Gilbert and Sullivan, and crucially, the Servicemen's Entertainment Unit. Stewart described theatre as vital to the war effort in terms of fundraising and helping morale, and her very first press reception, what we would call a press conference, was for Gracie Fields, and it was attended by the US General Douglas MacArthur, who was a wartime celebrity in Australia and widely credited with introducing modern public relations in Australia. According to Stewart, press receptions then were very formal. You stood at the entrance of the function room with the guest of honour, and you introduced each guest, gave particulars of their paper, radio station, or whatever reason they were there, and after handshakes, they moved on. And it was my role to remember each person's name. Stewart helped found the Business Girls War Service Bureau, and as secretary used all her public relations expertise to raise funds to support the war effort and held fortnightly dances for soldiers on leave. By the end of the war, her own marriage had broken down. She said it was difficult for men who'd been at war to settle afterwards. And theatre was really popular post-war, and Stewart worked hard. She remarried to another returned soldier, and again, the marriage only lasted a couple of years. The wedding made the social pages, though, with reference to Stewart continuing to work in theatre as a married woman, showing how attitudes to women in work had changed. However, Stewart's position at JCW also didn't last. She was shocked to be given 2 weeks' notice in 1949, with no thanks or appreciation for her wartime service. As she wrote in her memoirs, employees, especially women in those days, had no status in the workforce. With the end of her marriage and no job, Stewart travelled to England in 1950 and again in 1953. She worked briefly for a British high-end fashion magazine, The Ambassador, and she sold magazine advertising, a job she hated, in Australia between her trips and on her return. Stewart was then asked to be the publicity officer for the Tivoli Theatre Circuit, and she started working for them in 1954, replacing Percy Crawford, who, according to Stewart, was one of the great publicists of the early days of vaudeville. And he was now in his 70s, and he'd never approved of any potential successes until Stewart. And she described him as a lovely man who was obviously quite a big mentor for her. The Tivoli Theatre was vaudeville, and it was described by Tivoli historian Frank Van Straten as chorus girls, legs, comics, and lots of noise. And this promotional photograph shows Hungarian-Australian theatre entrepreneur Tibor Rudis promoting his vaudeville show Oriental Cavalcade, which I wrote about in the book edited by Tasos. Stewart. It also, the significance of this show is it allowed Stewart to establish her own consultancy and step out from an employee into a public relations, to be an entrepreneur. Stewart looked after many visiting stars and entertainers at the Tivoli. She said she got to know the stars well because I got to know them between the airport and the hotel. I talk to them like, you know, how's everything? How's the family? Do you want to do any shopping? Here's my number. And Stuart's work included extensive media relations as well as cross-promotion with department stores and other retailers. And in this picture, you can see Stuart, which comes from Stuart's own press cuttings book. So she had, for every campaign, every star she had a scrapbook with all the press cuttings and photos and any promotional material that was produced. And in this particular image, she's interviewing a very young Shirley Bassey in Foy's department store. Stuart liked using what she referred to as a gimmick to get media attention. And it was maybe what we would call the hook or the pitch. The advanced publicity she received for Julia Davis, that she was a millionairess who had turned down 25 marriage proposals, gave Stuart the hook she needed for her 1956 campaign. She said, I had a string of Mercedes meet her, I had security for her jewels, and she was a dream on publicity. And Davis was happy to do extensive charity work, which provided numerous photo opportunities, and she attended social events such as the races. She famously had picked the winner of the Melbourne Cup that year, which made her a big celebrity in Melbourne. Another star and a person who became a very close friend of Stuart's was Winifred Atwell, who was a honky-tonk pianist. They met because she used to promote her at the Tivoli, and after she left the Tivoli and established her own consultancy, she continued to promote Winifred Atwell. And these are just some of the images. And whenever Atwell was in Melbourne, and she came to Australia frequently, she really loved Australia and bought a house in New South Wales. She would host cocktail parties to thank the press. And you can see just from these images that she was quite a character. Incidentally, she had a PhD in chemistry. The reason I wanted to talk about this particular promotion or this friendship is it allowed Stuart to engage in issues of race and campaign for Atwell to have permanent entry to Australia. She was outraged that Atwell had to come in on a temporary visa each time and couldn't get residency, despite being, having a PhD, despite having being quite a celebrity in her day and owning property in Australia. Because of the White Australia policy, she couldn't get residency in the country. And Stuart made this front page news. She campaigned for Atwell and to highlight issues of race. And there's other evidence in her archives about her relationships with a First Nations pastor, Doug Nichols, her interest connecting Nichols with performers of colour who came to perform at the Tivoli. She would take them to Nichols' church. There were invitations for her to go to the launch of an Aboriginal girls' hostel, for example. So she had an interest or developed an interest in race and race relations in Australia, which for the time I think was quite groundbreaking. So in 1958, one of the directors of the Tivoli died of a heart attack, and there was some tension between Stuart and his son who took over. Also, television was introduced to Australia in 1956. It was competing with vaudeville audiences, even though the first ever Melbourne television broadcast was from the Tivoli Theatre. Tivoli performers featured regularly on television thanks to Stuart's efforts. And so she was involved with television and broadcast from the very beginning. But she thought it was time to resign, so she negotiated with Ty Barudis to continue promoting his show Oriental Cavalcade for its seasons in Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane. She said, I walked out the door of the Tivoli Theatre as the publicity officer, and after a 3-week holiday, I walked back into the same office, promoting Oriental Cavalcade with a public relations company registered as Betty Stewart Enterprises. She received 4 times her weekly salary and travelled between the 3 cities promoting the show for 6 months. But she was always keen to return to Melbourne and focus on growing her consultancy and finding new clients. So this is another picture of Stuart at work with her 19-year-old secretary, Marion Carter. Stuart continued to promote Rudis's shows, which provided her with a regular income as she sought to expand her client list. So new clients in 1960 included Volkswagen, the inaugural Moomba Festival. It's a community event in Melbourne, which is still running, and many touring acts for other promoters, including Bob Crosby, which we saw in the first photo, Cilla Black, the Kinks, the Van Trapp Family Singers, and the Dave Brubeck Quartet. Her campaigns generally embraced media relations, charity work, cross-promotions with brands or department stores, press events, invitations to opening nights, and so on. And she also managed some artists. She became a licensed theatrical agent. Most notably, the teenage heartthrob Johnny Chester, whom she insisted on being billed as Australia's #1 teenage idol. Beyond the entertainment sector, Stewart gained new clients that often represented changing social patterns around consumption, shopping centres and supermarkets, shipping lines, the Revlon count for Australia, Helena Rubinstein's new makeup lines, and even tennis and cricket competitions that were crafted particularly for broadcast. She opened a Sydney office in the early 1960s, saying that Sydney was more international, and she eventually closed the Melbourne office and moved to Sydney to focus on growing her client list. Perhaps her most high-profile campaign was the Beatles tour of Australia. And at the time, Stewart said she and her secretary managed all the publicity. She said of the secretary, she was the envy girl of the whole of Australia, but she was working like a dog in the office all day. She'd bring me messages, and we had the whole world ringing us up. And Stewart's role included organising Paul McCartney's birthday party and finding attractive girls between 15 and 22 to be there. And she arranged an exclusive interview with one newspaper to finance that party. However, Stewart found being self-employed and employing other consultants really hard work. She found it really stressful to get new clients. She took a break in 1967-68, temporarily closing her agency to travel to Europe and America. And then she reopened in partnership with Paula Peters. They called themselves BSPP, incorporating Betty Stewart Enterprises. But for her, she wasn't loving it anymore. So they closed that in 1971 so that Betty could focus on one of her most demanding clients, Weight Watchers. She'd promoted their launch in Australia and New Zealand and continued as their public relations director, retiring for the first time in 1981. She said she'd met the love of her life and married for the third time, and she just wanted to be Mrs. Hollis. However, in 1986, Stewart rejoined Weight Watchers and continued to work for them until 1992. Remember, she'd started her career back in the 30s. Her last client is significant as it enabled her to move out of consultancy work and it ensured a steady income. It enabled her to travel widely across Australia and New Zealand, but also to the United States. And it points to the way that public relations work targeting women was often done by women. And it also points to the importance of lifestyle public relations and the role of public relations in shaping ideas around femininity and health through the promotion of diet cultures. So as I said earlier, Stewart was keen to have her achievements in public relations history recorded. So in 2000, she published her autobiography. Between 1999 and 2002, Stewart donated many of her records to the Australian Performing Arts Collection. And in 2004, she recorded the oral history, which is housed in the National Library of Australia. And Stewart lived until she was 99 and died on Christmas Day in 2014. I've argued previously that the feminisation of public relations resulted in particular anxieties around its professional standing, and it led to an intensification of professionalisation. So, for example, the senior membership categories of the Professional Institute excluded non-strategic work by framing it as non-professional. And that was a way of writing out women's work. History say much more about the present than the realities of the past. And too many public relations histories focus on the Professional Institute and the achievements of its male members. So including women does not necessarily conform to including women and the kinds of work they performed does not necessarily conform to the masculine professional project or the strategic management discipline that you find in corporate sectors. I'd argue it allows us to rethink public relations and where it came from. I'm not, in presenting this case study of Betty Stewart, trying to insert a great woman into public relations history. Rather, I'm trying to think through how public relations impacted on the lives of women and what the everyday public relations work actually entailed. So studying Betty offers us some insights into the challenges, particularly for women, the precarity of her consultancy, competing with less experienced male practitioners, often former journalists who'd lost their jobs when touting for work. So despite her 30 plus years experience, she sometimes missed out. And she found this incredibly frustrating. And I've seen the letters to friends in the archives about it. She found a lot of discrimination with corporate clients and in sport, but felt she had incredible freedom as a woman in the theatre to do what she wanted and some authority. And although her work in celebrity and entertainment perhaps overshadows her other work in her own accounts, indeed it may seem somewhat frivolous if we're talking about serious public relations. As I've noticed, she didn't shy away from difficult issues such as race when she campaigned for Winifred Atwell to get permanent residency in Australia. Triangulating the data that I could find on Stewart only highlights some of the inaccuracies and the unreliability of personal narrators about their own histories. For example, she said she had established the third public relations consultancy in Australia. I can't find any evidence to support that claim, but it's a big one that she made looking back on her life's achievements. She certainly was a contemporary of Eric White, who's often held up as one of the first consultants, but again, I would dispute that claim. Other examples of unreliability. In her book, and indeed in her oral history interview, Stewart identifies 3 husbands. The first 2 are barely mentioned, and she acknowledged the difficulty for returning soldiers and settling down. And the focus very much is on her current husband at the time that she wrote the books. But in newspaper articles that were long-form feature interviews with her not long after she moved to Sydney, she talks about another husband who's not recorded in any of her own records. He was a well-known band leader, and I can find no confirmation that this marriage actually took place. And Stewart's certainly written him out of her life stories, even though he was photographed and featured in those interviews, those published interviews. Studying Stewart offers unique insights into the kinds of everyday work that have not been well captured in other histories. And it's an important, I think, historical context for understanding branding and lifestyle cultures, as well as the significance of gender, labour and precarity today. It enables us to rethink public relations work through the stories which have been marginalised and excluded, and offers an important and highly relevant alternative history to public relations. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate, for that. That was super interesting. Could I? Do you mind if I get a question for each? Martina, I think you provided a very comprehensive list of Nancy Astor's achievement. Would you say that something stands out in her contribution? What did you observe from your research?
Do you mean in terms of political PR?
Yeah.
Yeah, I particularly like this issues management, which I think it's because news management and, working with the press and writing articles and managing the media relations, that's traditional, that existed for a long time. But like in those years, 1920s, to do this issues management and this personal reputation building and management in politics, I thought that was quite interesting. Particularly in this stubborn refusal of subscribing to gender norms and no, I'm going to talk about my policies because this is how I build my agenda. And that focus on behavior, like building an agenda to change the opinion of the British public to influence policy change. And it was done very clearly and very strategically. And at the same time, roughly actually before the British government started those behavioral campaigns. And sometimes I do wonder, did she maybe influence those campaigns that started in the 1930s and 1940s? There is no evidence, obviously, for that. I just something that makes me wonder. But she did work during the 1930s as well, concurrently with the UK government running those campaigns. And I thought that was quite interesting and ahead of time in a way.
Absolutely. It is indeed. Kate, I love the whole research. You know how some claims were you couldn't support them. It seems that Betty Stewart is one of the most a very interesting case to investigate and explore. I was just thinking in this kind of wider context, Australia is one of the leaders in PR education. And I was wondering, perhaps, the claims that you made that Betty Stewart established a third PR agency in Australia, it actually made me think, is history of PR taught much in Australia? Is it like a separate module? And by extension, is Betty Stewart like a case study? You see the air quotes there.
Well, she's in my course, Tasos.
Of
My
course.
teaching. Look, yes, public relations is usually one chapter in Australian textbooks. And it's problematic because that is problematic for me anyway, because that chapter is usually confined to being a history of the professional institute. It plays into this narrative of General Douglas MacArthur was the American general, was based in Australia, had a wartime information unit, and that was the catalyst for modern public relations in Australia. So everything that happened before then was not professional, and professional public relations started around 1949, 1950 with the founding of the first institute. And of course, history is written by the victors, and it's written by the male founding members of the Sydney-based institute. It ignores the other institutes that open in other states because it wasn't a federated association, it was a New South Wales-based one. And Asher Joel, who worked for MacArthur, he's seen as the founding father of public relations in Australia. And I think that's the narrative that tends to be taught in universities. That's the narrative that's included in textbooks. And then you get this history that's a steady evolutionary progression to the modern profession. So as I said, the histories we tell us much more about the present and the concerns of the present, and the concern to present public relations as a strategic management discipline and as an ethical contributor to society. And yet we've got lots of evidence that's not the case. There's lots of what Karen Miller-Russell calls embarrassing moments in public relations that we should be reclaiming. So I guess my interest in writing history and researching these stories is writing back in the stories and people who've been left out. And that, for me, offers an alternative history, and one that I think is more honest or truthful. It kind of unleashes it from the professional association and that professional narrative.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Kate. I'll actually take that pass to say that, to repeat probably what I said at the beginning, that this is a research area which isn't exhaustive. This is merely the beginning, of challenging things which are around, and to give a closure, because I'm wary that we're approaching the 60-minute limit. That we hope that everyone did enjoy the webinar. I'm sure that we'll have more people joining us from both our networks, and they will be contributing as well. And just before we go, both the International History of PR Conference and the European Public Relations History Network are connected deeply, as both were founded by Emeritus Professor Watson and supported greatly by so many wonderful people, colleagues, just like you two, who are today, and all of them have made their own landmark in the field of PR and PR history. There is a very clear overlap of people participating in both networks, to be honest. And I've been privileged, even though it has been an overwhelming task occasionally, to take leadership of both networks after Tom's retirement. But this isn't and can't be a one-person job. We all have a role to play when it comes to making history. So I'll just like to extend an invitation for other people listening to us right now, or who are interested, to join us in making history. We're just an email away. Thank you very much to both for joining us.
Thanks, Tasos. Thanks for inviting us.
Thank you.